culture of people like working too much, or like things that aren't necessarily, aren't even necessarily related to like the core of the DNA itself. Like people aren't like you know, going off message, or like using the brand for things we wouldn't like use the brand for, but are like doing damaging work of creating a sort of hurtful culture in the organization or in the movement. So yeah, I wonder, is, maybe you're getting to that later, but I'm wondering, like, in terms of defending the DNA, like how much of it extends like to the sort of cultural aspects, and how much takes place sort of like beyond action settings.
We'll talk about this, we'll address this. Thank you. Others? Kevin?
I'm just kind of thinking about, is this, I'm seeing this defending the DNA as kind of happening when momentum happens and it's absorbed. But I'm personally thinking about like how this is even possible when the momentum happens. So like, let's say, you know, the immigrant rights march, right, like 1.2 million came out, right? We didn't necessarily organize them, right? We didn't actually go through any initiation training, right? And then, you know, I mean, I noticed, right, just, you know, just being involved enough to circles, that there are certain groups that are specifically there to, you know, agitate people in these incidents, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, how do you...
But if the DREAM, let's say there was 10,000 DREAM Act students that did go through an initiation training and did feel collectively responsible for holding nonviolent discipline at that march of 1.2 million. And then somebody did throw a rock, you know, whatever. I bet you, randomly, there would have been one DREAM Act student that says, look, that's actually hurting our movement, man. Like, I'm not a monitor, but I don't want you to do it. In Serbia, they trained 40,000 people. The general strike involved over 1 million. But those 40,000 people held the collective discipline of those 1 million people. And now there was some breaks, but it was because they got to 1 million. Like, it was super easy to defend when it was just the 40,000.
It depends also, Kevin, the stage that you're in. So that, for example, some struggles are already not going to have a properly developed traditions and principles. So the way that I separate this is like way before, you know, like you really think through it. But if you're in the midst of it, you gotta do as much of this as you can, you know, and it really depends on the time that you have. You know, if it's like a day, at least do monitors, at least, you know, like if you have a couple more days, like really get action agreements, you know. If you have 5-6 days, do a freaking mass training with as many people as you can to get action agreements so people can monitor and things cannot go nuts. So it really depends on the stage that you're in. But I also want to say that this is just, as Katie said, this is not just about actions, because there's also a bunch of group problems that happens. Not when you have momentum, but when you're even trying to plan momentum around the planning and the organizing of the movement organization that can now inhibit creating momentum. So we'll talk about those in a second.
I'm confused.
Yay!
So, like a lot of this stuff I think is about nonviolent discipline, and like you said, like some of the other common problems. But I always wonder about like the politics, basically.
Right.
Like, what if people start doing shit that's just stupid? You know, like, so like the example I was thinking of, obviously if it's within the larger theory of change, blah blah blah. But like, what if there's a part of the movement that's like, okay, we're gonna do electoral stuff now, and like that's how we're going to like engage active popular support, and we're, you know, and that would really confuse like the outsiders about what it meant to be part of the movement, right? Because there are folks who are doing all this electoral stuff, and if you're trying to do an outside strategy, how do you, if that's part of your DNA, like how do you defend something like that?
Well, actually, okay, so let's look at the DNA. Look at all those things. We think you should try to develop principles or traditions, let's call them principles, around all those things. So grand strategy should, generally, your grand strategy and your theory of change should include whether or not you're building a popular movement to move active popular support, or whether or not you're doing electoral or instrumental work. Okay? And then the 4 lines of defense are there to defend that principle among everybody. So it's not just nonviolent discipline, and we're gonna go over some examples of those principles.
I guess I'm just thinking of examples like in Serbia, Ivan would talk about like, well, we would just go talk to them then. Right, like, well, if there was somebody who was doing something really dumb, like in terms of the last line of defense, like politically, that they were like, oh, you shouldn't actually go after that opposition party right now because of something, something, something,
That's
something,
it.
right? They would go talk to them. Well, it's like, well, the United States is a lot larger of a country. Not that we couldn't go talk to certain amounts of people, but if it like really started to spread, then how, you understand what I'm asking?
Yes, but that's why you have to have, through mass training, a cadre of people that are willing to defend it.
Oh,
So it's not
locally.
just 7 people, but it's
Right.
1,000 leaders across the country that have been through mass training and are willing to defend the DNA.
And you need, the principles it really teaches you that you really have to think through deeply the principles. In 12-step, those traditions are super tight. And when he goes through the long explanation, he has a whole book called the 12 and 12, which explains why the principles are there.
In 12 years.
I know, in 12. So the 12 and 12 has every principle and all the problems that, the reason you have that thing. So it's gonna predict, oh, some people are gonna advocate for electoral stuff. That's not a bad thing, but it's not within our popular movement. Or it is, if you're gonna make your popular movement about that, right? You have to define that from the get-go. It has to be part of your DNA. Because if not, you can't depend on the top level leaders to enforce that.
Perfect. Let's get a couple more, Yes, sir.
Not a question that needs to be answered, but I found myself actually really like curious about your actual example about the fuck the police sign and the mechanism for how a crowd kind of subtly is like, hey man, like, turn your side upside down or whatever. And I just realizing how much messaging also could be super nuanced, even if it's really front loaded into principles. Like in the moment, that seems still very difficult, even for a crowd to kind of like do that in a nuanced way. But I think you're gonna say training principles, build it in your DNA.
Well, in Serbia, that's right. So the principle, in Serbia, they said, and I think we talked about this, Belinda brought this up, is that when somebody was gonna throw a rock, the whole crowd responded
Right.
instantly.
That's cut and dry, like.
Yeah, because they were so well trained. And they were taught to be collectively responsible for the DNA. And believe me, even people that really believe in diversity of tactics and property destruction and throwing stuff, if the crowd is not behind them, they will not do it.
But like, don't be too angry or like, don't be obnoxious is like harder to like, suss out in the moment. Right? Or like, you can't just like people who beat your community. Like,
I mean, I don't wanna get too stuck on the in the streets piece, but for example, like during, and we were talking about this the other day, during Occupy, there was a whole practice that was started through, something that was called spring training and then summer disobedience school called the Plus Brigades to kind of in a light-hearted way de-escalate a lot of spaces or do mass crowd control as long as there were people placed throughout the space. And so it was the kind of thing where you'd be in a crowd, something like started getting weird, intense, and then one person would call one of the signals, and there were enough people in the crowd who would start following the signal that the rest of the crowd was just like, all right, I guess something's happening, and I'll either watch or participate. And it goes to a friend of mine who's in the military said, the thing that they're always taught is that when shit hits the fan, you don't rise to the heights of your better angels or whatever, you rise to your highest level of training. And that's the, and there's the Eisenhower quote that a lot of us heard last year of, the plan is nothing, the planning is everything. So that you can anticipate, the thing that, you're gonna have to throw out your plan 100 times, but if you have been through the planning process, then you have the tools and the exercise to, okay, what's happening in front of me is not what I expected, but I still can call this sign and all these people will come to me and help to de-escalate the situation.
There's multiple different models of this. One, Gandhi used this thing called Shanti Sena. Are you guys familiar with this? So basically the monitors, if there was a problem, they wouldn't just intervene individually, but they would yell out the signal, Shanti Sena, Shanti Sena, and then everyone was taught to come and help. It was basically a signal for the crowd to collectively enforce nonviolence. Now, so there's a whole politics about whether or not it's that. People have changed that concept, and there's all this politics about whether or not you use that signal or this signal or whatever, but the concept's the basic thing, is that the monitors are there to evoke, to get the crowd not to be passive observers, but to collectively enforce.
Back to your response to Max's question, I would have thought that the DNA, no matter how it's formulated, would be agnostic on the question of whether you might run an electoral campaign, because I would think that would be on the level of tactic, and that just wouldn't be something you'd consider. I get why the DNA would certainly not be agnostic on the question of starting a riot during a nonviolent protest, but I couldn't imagine why the DNA would have an opinion one way or the other. Like, if you're on the core leadership team, in your head you might think, this really isn't, I don't believe in electoral politics being the reform mechanism, but like, you know, if Joe and his group want to go out and do that, they're certainly still part of my movement. They're not my favorite people in my movement, but yeah, why would you have an opinion one way or the other?
So this is what I would share. Let me ask you a quick question, because I think this is what's coming up in the group. How many of you are already beginning to anticipate the problems in your movement? So this is the thing. It's like, sometimes we say, well, could that really happen? I don't think so. And then does it happen?
Yes.
And you're like, holy shit. And then somebody at the end says, I had a hunch. And I didn't believe it because we were here, so we were cool. Yeah, we were. What about the rest? So this is what I would say, because before we get into the traditions of going explanation, let's take just a minute or a minute and a half and write down what are some of the problems that you're already beginning to anticipate, either with your movement, or actually, maybe let's make it more simple, with you taking this stuff home. What are some of the resistance, what are some of the problems that you're anticipating? Just write them down, just write them down. Let's take a minute and a half.
So if there's no group for whom that's easier than us.
Yeah.
Oh, you want a problem? Oh, we got a problem.